author, columnist, editor-in-chief of LibertyNation.com, talk show host, and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Hello and welcome to Liberty Nation Radio. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's special edition, we are talking FBI undercounting defensive use of firearms. We're talking what's happening in New York City. We're also talking how the exodus of illegal immigrants from America is affecting the housing and economic markets, and a whole lot more. It's going to be quite the show. Please remember, Liberty Nation Radio is sponsored by LibertyNation.com. You can access podcasts, breaking news analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. And you're here on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. We're very fortunate to have with us Liberty Nation's chief political correspondent and satirist, Mr. Graham J. Noble. Thanks for being here, Graham.
It's a pleasure, Mark.
So, Graham, there's something that I think our audience would be fascinated to learn about because it's really not publicized much. And you wrote what I consider the definitive piece on this. And that's a compliment both to your writing, but also to the fact that hardly anybody else in the country has covered this topic. But it was entitled, FBI Massively Undercounted Defensive Gun Use for Years. And you can go and read that on the page of LibertyNation.com. Now, Graham, we all know that there is an effort to minimize and so there's some extremes here, aren't there? There's to minimize the story of a good guy with a gun stops a bad guy with a gun. There's a huge effort to minimize that. And I've tried thinking this through on so many levels. Why would somebody want to do that? And the best answer I can come up with is because otherwise criminals might be dead. And that seems to me the grandest reason for it. You know, criminals who are in the process of committing a crime with a firearm might be dead, and therefore we should minimize that. The other reason behind why these things would be undercounted is because there's a general anti-gun prevalence, not just in the media, but also in many levels of government. Now, Graham, if you could give us the outline of your brilliant article on that.
Well, basically, Mark, between I believe it was 2014, 2000 and 2024, so a 10-year period, the FBI, and I use the word massively in the title of the article because it really is a massive discrepancy. The FBI came up with numbers that showed that in something like less than 3.5% of all active shooter scenarios. Now I'll come back in a minute to define active shooter for our audience because it's not the same as, say, a mass shooting. In less than 3.5% of those incidents did a armed civilian intervene in some way with a weapon to stop what was going on, to interfere with the shooters. And the Crime Prevention Research Center, they did a study and they found out that in fact the percentage of those interventions by armed civilians was just way higher than that. It was something like 30-something% off the top of my head, if I remember. Now, what an active shooter scenario is, that's basically when anybody in a public space opens fire with a weapon. Now, it doesn't matter if they don't kill anybody. It doesn't even matter if they don't hit anybody, actually. Once someone opens fire in a public area, that they are classed as an active shooter. So it's not, again, we're not talking about mass shootings here. We're talking about just those active shooter scenarios, which happen. Well, the FBI says that they don't happen as much as they do. And here's the problem. See, the FBI are going by the data that is getting reported to them by law enforcement agencies around the country. Now, there's no standard for that. There's no mandatory reporting. There's nothing. And so therefore, what are those local law enforcement agencies reporting? Are they undercounting their numbers, or are they just simply not reporting to the FBI at all? That's possible. The Crime Prevention Research Center, what they did was they scoured through media reports of active shooting, so local media reports from all over the country, and that's how they came up with their figures, which were much greater than the FBI figures. So so basically what I'm saying is, yeah, maybe because there are a lot of people in the FBI who are kind of anti-gun, don't want civilians to have guns. So did the FBI deliberately undercount these, or were they just going on bad numbers?
Well, here's the issue. The first point that maybe they don't want civilians with firearms, that's almost besides the point when it comes to presenting the data, isn't it? Because the FBI know, as well as you and I do, and as well as in some circles, that they admit that their data is incomplete. As you say, there's 50 different states. Within those 50 different states, there are multiple municipalities, and there's no standardized reporting on this. So some places just aren't reporting. Some places are reporting as something different, and some places are reporting on a different timescale. So when they try and collate all the data, I think the FBI should be honest enough and say, this figure that we're presenting is only based on a minimal proportion of the data available. However, what you have is the media, the Fourth Estate, picks up this idea and runs with it. It's like 3%. It's tiny. It's minuscule. Now, I love the fact that you delineate between active shooter and mass shooter. And that's another statistic that just always kind of blows my mind how these are measured. So, and we see this, there's this massive denigration, particularly of, and, you know, I'm batting for the home team here, particularly of white men. And it says, you know, white men are the shooters in so many of these cases. It's white men who are dangerous. We've heard that from elected politicians espousing this in public. It's white men who are the real danger because they're involved in what they classify as mass shootings. And what's always struck me as funny is that they've decided to exclude gang violence from mass shootings. So there are multiple times more people killed by gang violence in what a layman's interpretation of what a mass shooting might be. So a shooting where a mass of people get shot. That's a layman's interpretation.
Yeah.
If we just counted those, what these divisive, and let's be clear, race-baiting politicians are saying, it's the opposite of the truth. It's on such a far end of the spectrum for what reality actually is, and it's being used for political purpose. Now, Graham, why do you think that these narratives, these multiple narratives we have, so defensive uses, for example, now those used to be counted by the CDC. So we're not even talking about somebody who stops an active shooter, but defensive uses in general against an assault, a robbery, a sexual assault, things like this. Those used to be counted, and they don't count them anymore. Do we have any idea why? Is it just political? Is there not the funding for it?
I think it's just because there are so many of them that it would crush the whole anti-gun narrative. I mean, if you think about how many times, I mean, look, a defensive use of a handgun could literally be some guy's in a convenience store and then some other guy walks in and pulls out, and you know, there are videos all over the internet of this all the time. Some other guy walks into that convenience store, pulls out a handgun, and points it at the clerk and says, "Give me the money." And some other guy in that store who's carrying actually pulls out his gun. And even if nobody fires, you know, the would-be robber sees that suddenly there's
sees the light
pointing down at him, and he runs out the store. Yeah. That is a defensive handgun use. Yeah. Or maybe, you know, just you're walking along the street and somebody comes up to you and you know, says, "Give me your wallet," and you just maybe show them that you're carrying a pistol, and they run off. I mean, you know, it's happened to me just less than 2 years ago. Some guys, I was driving down a road late in the evening. It was dark. Car in front of me was brake checking me. I flashed my lights at him, and then next moment, two guys got out of this car. One of them had a tire iron in his hand, and they started walking towards me, and I carry all the time. So I just rolled down my window and I didn't even point the pistol at him. I just kind of held it up like this out of the window. And I just said, "Is there a problem?" And the guys just turned around, got back in the car, drove off. That's a defensive handgun.
It's a defensive use. Yeah. So
no police reports were fired. No shots were fired. No police reports were filed. So nobody That's not in the statistics. How many times a year throughout this country does that kind of thing happen? Thousands of times. And so that's why they don't report numbers anymore.
The last data that I got from the CDC before they stopped counting this stuff, and do forgive me, audience, if I've got this wrong, but I believe it was 2.5 million uses per year of reported defensive uses of firearms.
Reported, yes.
Yes, reported. And that's going to be, in reality, a hell of a lot more. And of course, at the end of this, what it all comes down to is how many lives have been saved by people legally carrying their firearms, exercising their constitutional rights.
And you're exactly right, Mark. And that was going to be my next point, in fact, because if you think about it, if you think there's a situation where a would-be criminal, whether he's a robber or a potential active shooter or whatever else this bad guy is got in mind, if he has a weapon, then if an armed civilian then intercedes and stops this guy, it's not possible to calculate the number of potential lives that were saved. You have no idea. It could be anything from 1 or 2 to, if it's a crowded place, 5, 10, who knows? It's an incalculable number. It's impossible. And I think that's another reason, because the anti-gun narrative is shattered when you point out to people that, hypothetically, maybe thousands and thousands of American lives are saved every year by law-abiding civilians with guns.
As they say, an armed society is a polite society. We'll be back with Graham Noble after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio. I remain your host, Mark Angelides, and we're continuing our conversation with Liberty Nation's Graham J. Noble. Thanks for sticking around, Graham. Now, we've talked about defensive uses of firearms and in the earlier segment, but one place where gun laws are very, very strict and likely to become more so should the lead contender win the mayoralty this coming November is New York City under Zoran Mamdani. Should he win, which all signs point to a landslide for the Ugandan-born socialist. Now, Graham, what is happening with Zoran Mamdani? Because it seems to me that New York is about to adopt quasi-socialist measures in every form that it can under his leadership. Now, I'm not one to judge, but, well, sometimes I am. I'm not one to judge, but it seems to me that socialist measures have a long history of failing time and time again.
Well, Mamdani has kind of put his party in a difficult position, really, by not intentionally, but he's done it by his mere presence on the national stage now, and that is that one thing that the left in general, not just the Democratic Party, but the left in general, one thing they've always done is they've always pretended that they don't really, some of their more kind of radical policies, they try to play them down. I mean, they've done this with the guns. How many times have you heard left-wingers say to conservatives, oh, stop making a fuss, we're not going to take your guns? But actually, that's exactly what they want to do.
And unless you're Beto O'Rourke, the perennial losing candidate,
that's
right, we're going to take...
He was willing, well, and I'll give the guy credit for just that. I'll give him credit that he actually...
He was honest,
Yeah, absolutely. But and they do this, and they've always done this with the socialist thing. They've always said, "Oh, no, we're not socialists." And
democratic socialists.
The democratic socialists, which is just a nonsense term anyway. No, we're not really socialists. But now with Mamdani and a lot of people now, a lot of the leaders of the Democratic Party have been loath to kind of really jump behind him, because they know if they do, then everyone else is going to just point at them and say, there, you are endorsing a socialist.
Yeah.
And so, Hakeem Jeffries, Chuck Schumer, the leaders of the Democrats in Congress, They've been loath to endorse him, but other Democrats have endorsed him, and it's almost as if they're kind of. I almost hate to use the word normalizing because it's become a trendy word, but it's like they are now normalizing socialism. Although even now, I think it was just CBS or NBC recently who just maybe yesterday even somebody on one of those networks came out and said, "Oh, look, Zoran Mamdani is just not a socialist. It's ridiculous." Mm-hmm. So they're caught between this thing. Do they keep denying he's a socialist, or do they actually say, or do they kind of cross the Rubicon and say, "Yeah, no, we're giving him our full backing." So yeah, he's a socialist. He's got our backing. We're good to go. But I think the other thing, Mark, is the Democrats might be a little loath to really throw their lot in with him completely, because I'm certain there are some of them that are realistic enough to know that if he does become mayor of New York City, which, as you said, seems likely, and if he managed to implement all the things he wants to implement, there is an extremely good chance that he is going to destroy New York City's economy. And then that's going to be like the proof in the pudding, if you like, where people can say, look what Mamdani, socialist, took over in New York City, and look what he's done to that city now.
Graham,
and everyone will be able to see it.
You know that if that happens, they'll just say, they didn't do it right, and we can do it better. Now,
that's right. Yeah, that wasn't real socialism.
That wasn't real socialism. Yes, that was something different. We'll do it better next time. So, Tim Donner, Liberty Nation's senior political analyst and longtime host of this here radio show, he did a great article on the shocking truth about Mamdani's socialist roots, and of course, Mamdani he's not just the Democrat contender for New York Mayor. He's the Democratic Socialists of America contender for the New York City mayor. And he quotes a string of, I wouldn't even know what to call these, to be honest with you, Graham, in his article about what the Democratic Socialists of America, of which Mamdani is the flag bearer, openly flag bearer, want. And I'll just give you a couple of quotes here. So Tim Donner writes, "They support performing abortions in churches. They believe prostitution and marriage are, quote, two sides of the same coin. They believe women and children are irreparably harmed by capitalism, and that and in asserting that being in a traditional family is akin to being in prison." What do you have to say to that, Graham? Final words.
Well, I mean, it just comes down to one of the kind of underlying principles of socialism in general, say that children and even adults, really, every citizen is essentially like the property of the government. I mean, that's really what that's really what they're getting at, is that all of the citizens, all the residents of a country like that, you are all essentially owned by the government, and particularly the children, which is exactly why they want to abolish the family unit, so that they can basically make children wards of the state.
Graham J. Noble, let freedom ring. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Mark.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I remain your host, Mark Angelides, and we are joined by Liberty Nation's economics editor and general fiscal whiz, Mr. Andrew Moran. Thanks for being here, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
So, Andrew, I want to talk about essentially how America, we're talking economics, housing markets, things like this, how it's changed since Donald Trump specifically ramped up his crackdown on illegal immigration. What's the view from 20,000 feet?
Well, you can see that. So, for example, one thing the administration recently pointed to was the number of foreign workers in the civilian labor force. So they use that number to determine the number of actual self-deportations. So Stephen Miller, I think he was on Fox News, and he said that, around 1 million people have self-deported because the civilian labor force numbers show that there was a 1 million decline in just the last few months alone. And that number is actually outdated. If you look at the latest number, that number is actually 1.45 million. So the number of foreign workers are really on the decline in the United States, and this is having a wide range of impact. Now, whether that's positive or negative depends on your answer.
Let's dig into those impacts. So from my position, and of course, my position is shadowed by my beliefs, my experience and things. But for me, I would say that they are majority positive impacts, as in Americans are can command a better market rate because there's fewer applicants to a job. Is that correct or incorrect?
Well, I guess it depends on what sector you're referring to.
Sure, of course.
Hospitality and leisure, which is heavily dominated by foreign workers, and yep, most likely. One thing, one number that you always want to look at, especially in the last few years, because this dates back to even before the pandemic, was the divergence between the employed foreign workers and employed U.S. born workers, and that gap has really narrowed. So just this year alone, the number of employed foreign workers has declined around, I think, 4 million. And the number of employed American workers is up about 2.4 million. So that number and that gap has really closed under the current administration. That largely has to do, of course, with how the president has handled immigration and the border crisis.
So the people who are least happy about this would be as Bernie Sanders calls them, the oligarchs. Because obviously wages along with energy are one of the let's rephrase that. Taxes, wages, and energy costs are the three big cuts to your bottom line. Taxes are coming down. I think we should get into what's happening here, but with the extension of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, taxes are generally coming down across all levels. In terms of energy prices are coming down as well. Only marginally. I expected them to fall more, but I think that there's a bit of a lag effect on that. Do correct me if I'm wrong. But with wages, they're going to have to go up because of the lack of immigration, the self-deportations, things like that. And, of course, the closing of the border, which means there's no new people coming in. I believe border crossings are down somewhere between 93 and 97%. And those people would go to work, but they go to work at very, very cut rates, which are undercutting American workers. So they get two benefits: taxes down, energy costs down, and one negative. But that negative, that's got to be good for the American worker, especially people looking to get into work, hasn't it?
Okay, all right. So there's a few things I got to touch upon. So
please unravel it.
On energy prices, they have come down. I recently did something about Labor Day gas prices. It's the lowest in about 5 years. Oil prices, they've fallen to as low as $61 a barrel, though at the time of this recording it's around it's actually risen to 65. Now when it comes to wages, so yes, wages are going up on the real, which is inflation adjusted for blue collar workers, it's the highest of any president in almost 60 years, rising 1.4% in the first 5 months of 2025. Nominal wage growth, it's still hovering around 4% on a year over year basis. Now, if you look at the last consumer price index report, you were not here, but if you read it, you see that surprisingly in this climate, because you have tariffs, you'd think that goods inflation would be the biggest driver of inflation. However, for whatever reason, services inflation dramatically rose and accounted for a lion's share of the July CPI increase. Now, many economists have presented theories. One of them is that immigration has played a role. So if you're having fewer illegal immigrants working in the service sector, therefore you're hiring American workers, and therefore you're paying them higher wages and they get, benefits or whatever the case. And that contributed to the price pressures in the services sector. And now a lot of economists and probably the entire Federal Reserve System, they pay more attention to the services side of inflation because it can serve as a broader indicator of where inflation might be heading. It's still very labor intensive. They still have the input cost pressures from a variety of areas. So, I was watching CNN the other day. I tortured myself.
I'm sorry to hear that.
And I saw a segment with Abby Phillips and this one, I think she's an economist. I forgot her name now. And she was saying how if you want higher wages, and if you want to have fewer immigrants, then you want to have higher services inflation. Now, I'm sure that is up for debate, but I thought that to be quite interesting at a time when everyone just hated inflation. But now she's saying, yeah, we as a conservative, she's saying, yeah, I want higher inflation now.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's one of those. It's putting the cart before the horse, I think, is maybe the right way to look at that. You want the effects of a higher inflation without necessarily the higher service inflation. Yeah, it is an odd way to look at it. It's a very odd way to look. Now let's talk about another sector here. I came across an article that I shared with you from Washington, D.C.'s most prominent newspaper, and it was about house prices and housing availability. And I read through that article and I sent it to you because I was amazed by one thing. The authors argued that there's no need for federal intervention because this problem is taking care of itself. And it seemed to stay away entirely from the fact that there are 2 million plus less people in the country than there were 6 months ago, which you'd think that would be like a huge indicator. That's like a big flashing sign saying there's more homes because there's 2 million less people in the country. What did you make of it?
Yeah, there were halfway through the article. It talks about I think it was the Federal Housing Finance Agency or the National Association of Realtors, and they said that the U.S. has a housing shortage, affordable housing shortage of around 4 to 5 million, but nearly half of that is in California. So therefore, that's it's really skewing the results. But why? But now, if you have the whole illegal immigration thing, a lot of illegal immigrants are in California. So if they're being shipped out of the state, going back to where they came from, then of course you're going to have more housing stock available. But one thing that a lot of people make a mistake on, they think that illegal immigration raises house prices. But that's not necessarily the case. The one area that they raise prices on is the rental side of the U.S. housing market, because of course, someone coming from Guatemala making $6 an hour, that individual's not going to be able to afford a house again.
Of course, this isn't the Obama days. The guy with $6 isn't going to be able to buy a mansion. This isn't 2009.
So anyway, they're more likely to rent, therefore crowding out a lot of American individuals. A lot of young people can't afford to buy a house, so therefore they lift up the rental prices. So the rental market is more of a concern when you look at the immigration file, and the rental market is still elevated. I mean, I think it was Redfin a couple of months ago. They said that rental costs were just $4 shy of the all-time high. So that's still an issue when it comes to housing inflation, housing affordability.
Yeah, I do wonder though if there isn't a more direct connection to that, because a lot of people, I know we talk about the really big companies buying up housing stock. Now that's clearly going to be putting price pressure on people wanting to get on the housing market. But there's also people who are doing, in England we call it the buy to let market. So it's some guy with a fairly stable job. He might buy a second property and then try and pay off that mortgage with the rental income from that. And so when you have pressures in the rental markets, that's also affecting what kind of mortgage rate they're getting, because if they have to rent at market value, then of course what kind of deal they're getting from the bank is also going to make a difference, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, over here in Canada, we have the exact same problem. I mean, I think the last number, I think it was from the Royal Bank of Canada, and they said that in the Ontario real estate market, I think is 60% of all new purchases came from investors who have 2 or more residential properties. So that's really exacerbating the issues that at the very least the Ontario housing market faces, and I'm sure over across the pond in the United Kingdom. Mortgage rates is another issue too. That's another factor that's really adding or exacerbating the housing affordability crisis, because when you have a 6% mortgage rate or 7% mortgage rate, then that's going to raise your monthly housing costs. And they say the rule of thumb is 30% of your income should be dedicated to housing. But the numbers these days is around 40 to 50%, which is unsustainable for a lot of people, especially if the U.S. labor market weakens, which recent data suggests that it is.
I've always thought that 30% number is insane. I don't think I've ever paid 30%.
I did.
Anywhere.
I did. I still do. I still do to this day.
That's crazy town. But that's Canada for you. That's I'm trying to think of the ending of Chinatown here, but That's Canada Town for you. We'll be back with Andrew Moran after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio. I remain Mark Angelides, and we're continuing our economics discussion with Andrew Moran. Now, Andrew, we are living in the wake of Jerome Powell's probably final Jackson Hole speech. And I guess the question on everybody's lips here is what's going to happen to the interest rate? And secondly, can people hope for more than a quarter point cut in the near future?
Okay, so the first question is, out of the Jackson Hole retreat, the conclusion was the Powell pivot. Because in his speech, he gave as much clear as answer as he could that interest rates will be coming. It was similar to last year's when he said it's time for policy to adjust. So the Federal Reserve, it's been on hold for rate cutting since January, and heading into the September meeting, according to the CME FedWatch tool or the Atlanta Fed's market probability tracker, overwhelming investors are expecting a 25 basis point interest rate cut. However, heading into that meeting is going to be a barrage of economic data that's going to decide whether to keep on hold or to cut. And that's the August jobs report, and that's the August consumer price index report, and the August producer price index report, perhaps the August import prices data. So these are huge factors that's going to weigh on the FOMC policy meeting decision.
I hate to be a jaded Jenny, as some say, but it seems to me that what's really going to make the difference on the decision is just how Jerome Powell's feeling about Donald Trump. Because, I mean, tell me I'm wrong, Andrew, because to me it seems as though the Fed's been playing politics in a very real way and not responding to actual market signals, as it did under Joe Biden. It did respond to clear market signals, and now not so much, as far as I can tell. Am I wrong?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I've argued, I've been in this profession for a very long time, and I've contended for many years that the Federal Reserve is a political institution, no matter what they say of how it's an independent entity devoid of any politics. Because there's just too many coincidences when it comes to the Federal Reserve, particularly in the past year, because the labor market and inflation were not very different from they were in September 2024. Now they say that, oh, it's about tariffs. We want to wait, and we have the luxury to afford to. We have the patience. We can be patient before adjusting monetary policy. But if you're focused entirely on data and you're data dependent, then you're not looking forward to the possibility that tariffs will raise inflation. And also, the other side of the dual mandate, is maximum employment. Now, if you're worried about the labor market, and it seemed like Jerome Powell was in that Jackson Hole speech, then and you're very well aware of the lag effect of monetary policy, then you would have acted months ago, or at the very least, you would have acted in July, like Governor Christopher Waller and Fed Vice Chair of Supervision Michelle Bowman. They were the dissenting votes at that July meeting, so you would have to cut rates right now. I mean, yes, you would. From an outsider, yes, the economy is growing, labor market remains relatively intact, inflation is not reacting as much as many people had anticipated when it comes to tariffs. But if you're a data dependent institution, then you're not focused on that. You're just focused on what the numbers are showing you, and that's showing you that okay, fine, cut interest rates.
Yeah, it seems he's just holding on for grim death from this, and there's a major impact to that. Firstly, of course, there's the impact on the American people with interest rates, but there's also a bunch of debt refinancing that needs to take place in the U.S. this year, and by having a rate cut in advance of that could save billions and billions of dollars in the federal government, which itself would have, I mean, if there's less debt in the government, less deficit in the government as well, there would certainly be a knock-on effect, wouldn't there? On the very factors that the Fed looks out for. So surely they're risking falling afoul of their two key principles by risking, so this is a convoluted way of doing it, but by risking the increased payback that the government will have, is that have I got this wrong?
Okay, so on paper, you would be correct. You think
Right.
that, okay, the Federal Reserve is going to cut interest rates, therefore the debt servicing costs are going to be lower because the 10-year yield, which is the benchmark Treasury security, that yield is going to decline. However, the exact opposite happened last year from September until January. The Federal Reserve was in rate cutting mode, but what happened? There was a complete divergence between the federal funds rate, which is a key policy rate for borrowing costs, and the 10-year yield. There was a complete divergence. It went like this, and nobody could explain why. There were various reasons, because many factors influence a 10-year yield.
Sure.
You have conditions of the economy, you have inflation, you have fiscal concerns. That was a legitimate fear that many economists had and investors had, especially after Trump's electoral victory, because they're worried that he was going to increase deficit spending. And you have the long-term national debt challenges. So there are many factors that would weigh on the 10-year Treasury yield. So yeah, cut interest rates now, but will that lead to lower mortgage costs, for example? Because again, the mortgage rate, that the 30-year focus on the 10-year Treasury yield.
Sure.
So it's not concrete that Jerome Powell cuts rates and then therefore interest rates are going to fall across the board. It's just one aspect of it. The 2-year yield, however, that tracks more of the federal funds rate, though that has less of an impact on the broader economy.
So we can realistically expect a quarter point. That's probably on the cards. That's like a 90% probability, would you say?
Well, yeah, the betting market the futures market does have a 90% chance of that happening, but there's so many wildcards heading into that, specifically the data I just mentioned.
So, what impact would that have on now I'm very specifically thinking between now and next June, July, August, what kind of an impact would that have on the American wallet if we get
a quarter point? Not much. It's what the Fed does after that, because the fear is that, especially among monetary policymakers, that if the Federal Reserve cuts interest rates in September, it doesn't necessarily mean that it will continue the rate cuts because of what happens with the economic data. But however, it depends on who is serving on the Federal Reserve Board, because now you have Stephen Myron, the former head of the Council of Economic Advisors. He's temporarily replacing Adriana Cutler, who resigned recently. And then you have that issue with Lisa Cook and who he's going to appoint. So therefore, if he appoints somebody who's sympathetic to his cause, then right there you have 4 votes supporting rate cuts. And then who he puts in Jerome Powell's place, that person will likely also support interest rate cuts. So, and then you have a couple of, who are flip-flopping on, like Austin Goolsbee. He may support a rate cut, but at the very least, you have 4 or 5 who would support rate cutting after the September policy meeting. Because the market is betting in two rate cuts, and the summary of economic projections also penciling in 2 rate cuts. But all depends on what the CPI and the PCE and the jobs numbers are showing.
Yeah, cuts tend to come in cycles rather than spikes, I think. So Andrew, final word. How's the economy looking? Scale of 1 to 10. It's not it's a number, not a word.
There's so many factors involved here. Long term, I would say probably 7 or 8, depending on all those investments from foreign and domestic companies are realized. But short term, there are too many headwinds to give it a high number.
Too many headwinds from the captain. Andrew Moran, thanks very much.
Thank you for having me.
And that's all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to thank our guests today, Graham J. Noble and Andrew Moran. And of course, thank you, the listeners at home, for taking the time each and every week to tune in. Please remember, Liberty Nation does not endorse candidates' campaigns or legislation, and this presentation is no endorsement. Thanks for being here.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.